I am a park ranger, and normally you can find me in Maryland. I live in Frederick, Maryland with my wife, and it's just us, and we have a little bunny rabbit as a pet. But we live in Frederick. I work at Antietam National Battlefield. I've also worked at Gettysburg National Military Park. Raise your hand if you've been to one of those two parks. Raise your hand if you've been to one of the 150th events, one of those two parks. Has anyone ever been on one of my programs before then?
No.
Okay, good.
Yeah, you're free.
So you know enough not to warn the others then, right? Okay, well, we're very glad you're here with us at Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park. As I said, I'm thrilled to be here, down here in the state of Georgia. This is now my fourth time having the opportunity and the blessing to work a 150th event for the Park Service. First Manassas, Antietam, Gettysburg, now Kennesaw, so I'm kind of hoping for Appomattox next year to keep the streak alive. But it's very good to be with you here this morning at Pigeon Hill here at Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park. Now, we talked about this a little bit already, but this park itself has a unique history of its own. Of course, originally preserved by land bought by Illinois veterans here on this very spot. They bought 60 acres in the 1890s. As we said, transferred to the War Department in 1917, becoming a unit of the National Park Service in the 1930s, along with so many of these other Civil War battlefields that were preserved and interpreted by the War Department. And Kennesaw Mountain, also as we were noting, doesn't have too many monuments on it. The Illinois Monument, the biggest, most grand of these monuments. Of course, that's why so much of the attention is here at Pigeon Hill. Of course, this is also where the main fighting happened at Kennesaw. When I think a lot of folks think of the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, they think of thousands and thousands of Union soldiers scaling the slopes of Big Kennesaw, a very imposing hill in this area. Well, there certainly was fighting at Big Kennesaw. Don't get me wrong, there was fighting there. Union skirmishers, a couple different regiments, were sent forward testing the Confederate lines on Big Kennesaw. But this was largely one regiment against one regiment, a few hundred men versus a few hundred men. Altogether, 400 casualties will occur for the Union Army up at Big Kennesaw. But the main fighting at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain is taking place 150 years and one day ago here at Pigeon Hill. Here, of course, named for Benjamin Franklin Cheatham, the Confederate division commander whose men were holding this ground. Well, I think it's very important for any ranger program to answer a few key questions. Why are we here? Why did this happen here? What happened here? And the so what factor. What does it matter to us 150 years later what happened? So we're going to try to answer these questions and answer a few others as we go through our program today. If you do have any questions, you can wait till the end if you'd like, or if you just really can't wait to hear the answer, I think I might be able to pause and try and answer it for you. And I will add that there's going to be an artillery firing demo at 9:30, and I'm going to do my best to make sure you have plenty of time to get up there for that firing demonstration. Okay. Now, of course, this battle, 1864, 150 years later, 2014. So we are now nearing the end of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. 150 years ago, of course, these men did not necessarily know that they themselves were nearing the end of the Civil War. By 1864, gone are the days of First Manassas, gone are the days of Antietam, gone are the days of Gettysburg. Horrific fighting has occurred throughout this country for several years by the time we get here. By the time this battle is fought, hundreds of thousands of people have already died in this war, and it is not yet over. Because 1864 will prove to be in many ways the bloodiest, deadliest, and most brutal year of the Civil War. And what happened here right on this spot is a perfect testament to that. Of course, we're here in the state of Georgia. How many of you are, by the way, just from Georgia here? Okay, good number of you. Good number of you. Well, of course, I'm a native of Ohio, so I'm really far from home. But here in the state of Georgia, in the summer of 1864, one of the pivotal events of the Civil War is occurring. I took the time before I headed down here to make up some pictures, because I know some of you are going to say, okay, well, why do I need to see a picture of this guy, who is, by the way, Sherman. Why do I need to see a picture of Sherman? Well, on every talk, there are Civil War buffs, and there are captives brought along with Civil War buffs. And sometimes those captives might not necessarily know who these folks are, or what they look like. So I try to please all folks here, try to make sure we're all enjoying the program. William Tecumseh Sherman, commander of all Union forces in the Western Theater of the Civil War. And when we say Western Theater, generally we're speaking about Tennessee, Mississippi, and yes, even the state of Georgia. Well, in 1864, Sherman is going to lead a massive army of 100,000 men south into this state. And his goals are twofold. Damage Southern war resources, do as much damage as he can to the Confederate ability to make war, and to attack Confederate forces commanded by this fella here, Joseph Johnston, commander of the Army of Tennessee. In the first week of May 1864, Sherman's forces began pushing south into the state. That same week in Virginia, Grant and Lee began the infamous overland campaign with thousands and thousands of men falling in the span of a few weeks. But while Grant and Lee are fighting it out in Virginia, Sherman and Johnston are maneuvering and fighting in Georgia. Throughout the month of May, Sherman will repeatedly pass up opportunities to launch strong assaults against Confederate positions, opting instead to try to outflank the Confederates, maneuver around their position, try to force them out through means other than frontal assaults. And these armies will move south into Georgia, Johnston retreating, Sherman advancing. And with every mile that Sherman advances, he is having to rely more and more upon railroads. Every mile that he moves further south, he's having to detail more men from his command to guard the rail lines moving south into Georgia, specifically the Western and Atlantic Railroad. And by June of 1864, these two armies have entered the terrain around Marietta, Georgia, in your backyard, in our backyard here, I should say. And on June 19th of 1864, Johnston will retreat and fall back to positions around Kennesaw Mountain, the Kennesaw Line, stretching far south of the mountain from here south to a place called Kolb's Farm, another one of the stops on the battlefield tour. Well, Johnston's lines at Kennesaw Mountain are impressive. And one of the most amazing things about Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park is that there are miles and miles and miles of earthworks that are preserved here. Trenches for you to see, for you to get a sense of what this must have been like for these soldiers. Some of those trenches are just behind us here on top of the ridge, just behind us. And thus, in June of 1864, these men are engaged in trench warfare. Now, 100 years ago today, there was an assassination that sparked the First World War. That's a little piece of history trivia for you. Archduke Franz Ferdinand assassinated 100 years ago today. Very significant event. The First World War, when folks think of trench warfare, at least in my experience, they often think of World War I, guys launching assaults out of trenches. Well, something kind of similar is happening here in the Atlanta campaign. Trench fighting around Kennesaw Mountain. And there's stagnation, there's skirmishing every day. Men are being killed by sharpshooters, bullets. If you stand too bolt upright in a trench, you're gonna get shot. One Ohio soldier said that we consider the pickaxe and shovel as weapons of war. Well, after several days of this here around Kennesaw Mountain, William Tecumseh Sherman issues Special Orders 28 on June 24th, 1864, ordering a large-scale assault against Confederate positions here at Kennesaw Mountain. Why does he do it? An excellent question. An excellent question. Why does he launch attacks against Confederate positions? I mean, just look at this terrain. We're not even on the main mountain here, folks. Look at that hillside. Would you want to stand down in that ravine and charge up to this position against Confederate infantry and Confederate artillery fire? No. No. And these guys, by 1864, there are some rookie soldiers in the ranks. But generally speaking, these are battle-hardened veterans. They know what it means to charge enemy works. Behind us here, strong Confederate works. In front of us, of course, the fields the Union soldiers have to encounter. So why does Sherman do this? Well, there's a number of reasons. He's frustrated. His supply lines are long. If those supply lines are cut, he and his army are in deep trouble, deep in the heart of Georgia. He's frustrated, his supply lines are long, and he really just wants to break through and end this campaign as quickly as he can. And thus he decides he's going to try a change of tactic. Instead of maneuvering around the Confederate position, he's just going to try and break through with a strong assault. And thus, June 24th, 1864, he issues Special Orders 28. These orders dictate that there's going to be two main assaults on the Confederate line on June 27th, 1864. One assault will be to our north, at Pigeon Hill, where 3 brigades from the 15th Corps Army of the Tennessee, commanded by James Birdseye McPherson, will assault Confederate positions. To the south, here at Cheatham Hill, Union soldiers in the Army of the Cumberland, commanded by George Henry Thomas, a Virginian who was loyal to the Union, stayed with the Union Army. 5 brigades from Thomas's command will launch assaults against Confederate positions. And thus on the 25th and 26th, these officers will go about preparing for the task ahead. They will choose the points for their assaults. And they're going to be aimed against 2 very strong fighting divisions of the Confederate Army. Just behind us, Benjamin Franklin Cheatham's men, who one Union officer described as the flower of the Southern Army. To his right, the division of Patrick Cleburne, an Irishman, born and bred, came to the United States, serving in the Confederate Army, one of the most famous and perhaps one of the best officers in the Western armies of the Confederacy. Well, these men had strong positions. They have trenches several layers deep. They have infantry in those trenches. They have several artillery pieces scattered along the line. And in front of these positions, especially in front of Cleburne's command, there are stakes. They have cut down tree saplings, sharpened the end, and woven them together, and formed stakes, something known in military terms as abattis, a French term, meaning that any Union soldiers who are going to charge the Confederate works are going to have to charge past sharpened wooden stakes towards lines of Confederate infantry and artillery. A very difficult task, no doubt. And thus, on the morning of June 27, 1864, Union soldiers prepare to go forward. That morning, some of the Confederates are gathered in the trenches, and they have some of their blankets and jackets stretched out over the top of the trenches to protect themselves from the heat of the Georgia sun. It was 100 degrees on the day of the battle here. And all of a sudden, early on the morning, artillery opens from the Federal position across the ravine. It starts bombarding these Confederates. Of course, they're quickly going to hop into those trenches. And soon, Union infantry will begin their assault. Now, to my left or your right, against Patrick Cleburne's men, was where the the men of the 4th Corps, Army of the Cumberland, will attack Confederate lines. Commanded by Oliver O. Howard. 3 brigades from the 4th Corps. Wagner's brigade, Kimball's brigade, and the brigade of a 28-year-old named Charles Garrison Harker, a recently minted brigadier general in the Union Army. Well, when the signal for these men to begin their assault is given, they will rush up over the trenches, begin charging forward towards Confederate lines. And this was a difficult task, no doubt. It was not an easy assault by any means. One soldier from Arkansas wrote of the Confederate position, "We had cut down and placed in our front hundreds of blackjack saplings as abattis, cutting off the tips of the limbs with our jackknives and whittling them so sharp and close, it would have been an uphill business for a rabbit to creep through." One newspaper correspondent from Cincinnati wrote, "During the brief respite that ensued before the word charge was given, the men rested silently in their places, and no one could have guessed from their undisturbed faces that all the latent gallantry of their natures could be aroused and lashed into a fury of heroism during the next 10 minutes. And thus these men will charge forward. And as they are charging forward, they're encountering a storm of shot and shell. And one Union officer who stayed behind, one Union soldier who stayed behind, left a recollection saying that these men were charging forward, quote, "to death or a Southern prison." Now think of those words. These men know what they are charging forward to, and they are still doing it. Many folks ask, well, why did they fight that way during the Civil War? Were they crazy? I mean, they're down here in Georgia in the heat and the humidity, and they got wool uniforms on. They're charging right into enemy fire. Were they crazy? No, they were not. They're using the best available tactics with the available fighting technology, the muzzle-loading muskets that could be fired 3 times a minute by an accurate soldier. They're using the best technology they have, the best tactics they have, and they're using the best courage and bravery that they have in trying to accomplish the missions that they are given. Doesn't matter if they don't agree with the assault. They have to carry out the orders nonetheless. As these men are charging forward, the Southern fire is simply tearing them through. It is an absolute slaughter. These men are being cut down. Some of the cannon, that the barrels are very low towards the ground, as the shot and shell is coming out of the cannon, as canister rounds are coming out of the cannon, essentially turning that large barrel into a large shotgun with little lead pellets flying out, cutting through infantry. The barrels are so low that when the flames come out, they're lighting dry leaves and the wooden stakes on fire. And if you're wounded and you're caught in the midst of this, you now have flames all around you, and soldiers are being burned to death. They're just a horrible, horrible situation for these Federals. Well, in the midst of this chaos is that 28-year-old general I talked about just a moment ago, Charles Garrison Harker. At the age of 12, he was orphaned, and he worked in a store in New Jersey. Well, the guy who owned that store was a congressman, got him an appointment to West Point when he was old enough, graduated from West Point in 1858. He's a young guy, 28 years old, leading men here in combat. Well, as he's riding forward, leading his men on his white horse, charging forward, he's hit in the arm, the bullet pierces through, enters into his chest. He's lifted up off the horse, taken back to a field hospital where he dies at 1 o'clock that afternoon. This assault by the 3 brigades of the 4th Corps, it is unsuccessful at a very high cost. Over 600 casualties, well over 600 casualties in those 3 brigades in their assault, and the men have to fall back. Well, to the right of that assault, here where we are at the famed dead angle on the Kennesaw Mountain battlefield, this is where 2 brigades from the 14th Corps of the Army of the Cumberland are assaulting Confederate positions. To your left and my right, the brigade of 25-year-old Colonel John Mitchell, an Ohio native, is charging forward against the flank of Maney's brigade and the rest of Cheatham's division. And here against the dead angle salient itself is the brigade of Colonel Dan McCook. Now, why is this called the dead angle here? Well, obviously it's an angle in the Confederate lines. Well, it's called the dead angle for a couple reasons. 1, because of what happened here. 2, if you are standing up at the top, of course, don't go in the trenches. It's best to follow the old adage of look, but do not touch to preserve the earthworks. If you're standing up where the trenches are, and you look out over this field, you will notice that not just because of the monument, but there's going to be a way that the ground slopes, where there is a dead spot in your line of sight. Meaning for some of the Union soldiers, there actually was a brief spot in the terrain where they were kind of hidden from the Confederate line of fire. It's very important for how these men are advancing. Well, on the morning of the assault, as Mitchell's brigade is sweeping up to your left, to my right, they're encountering a strong fire from the Confederates in the trenches. One Tennessee officer said that the fighting was so chaotic and so confusing, the musket fire was so loud, the cannon fire was so loud, the smoke in the air was so heavy, he couldn't see, he couldn't hear anything. The only way he knew that his own gun was going off was by the concussion of it firing against his shoulder. Another Tennessee officer noted that his men's gun barrels were becoming so hot that the lead bullets were actually starting to melt a little bit as they were going in, and thus he had his men turn his gun barrels over, and little bits of melted lead and wax, which they used to wrap the cartridges in, were rolling out of the guns down onto the ground. Needless to say, for Mitchell's brigade, the result is the same as those of Kimball, Wagner, and Harker. They are stopped in their tracks. But here at the dead angle, this is where the brigade of Colonel Dan McCook, 29 years old, assaulted the Confederate ranks. McCook, a very famous officer, member of the fighting McCook family from Ohio. 17 fathers, sons, brothers, cousins, nephews, all fighting for the Union cause in various positions in the Union Army. Well, before McCook leads his men into battle, he actually recites poetry. He recites a stanza of poetry from Horatius by Thomas Macaulay. He says, "That outspake brave Horatius, the captain of the gate, death cometh upon this earth to every man soon or late, and how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods?" And after he says that, almost as if on cue, the order to go forward is given, and at 9 a.m., these men start sweeping up the slope here on this open ground. No, it was open then. What we see today is about 1/3 of the open ground. If you imagine it, there's another third, essentially, another field this size in that direction, to your right, and to your left, another bit of open ground that size as well. So this is about 1/3 of the open field, the middle third. Does that make sense? Okay. As these men are sweeping up, Confederate guns on either side of the dead angle are firing canister in their ranks. Confederate infantry up at the angle itself are firing their muskets into their ranks. Sir, was it you who was asking about Sam Watkins? Sam Watkins, a private in the 1st Tennessee, positioned just up here behind us on the angle. Firing and loading, firing and loading. There are men behind these guys on the front, loading the guns, passing them forward. They will fire, pass it back, get a new loaded musket, keep firing, keep firing. He estimated, of course, with hyperbole, that they killed anywhere from 20 to 100 men each. Of course, hyperbole. Later that day, when Watkins undressed, he noticed that his arm was all bruised and blistered from the heat and the concussion of his gun going off repeatedly here at the angle on the morning of the battle. Now, I'm sure many of you, of course, we said earlier, I told you raise your hand if you've been to Gettysburg. Many of you have been to Gettysburg. Have you heard of Pickett's Charge before? Yeah. Pickett's Charge is a good reference point. Most folks have heard of it. Pickett's Charge, huge Confederate assault against Union forces, okay? As some of these Confederates were nearing the end of the charge at Gettysburg, they're leaning forward, kind of tipping their hats down, almost like they're walking into a strong rain and windstorm. Almost like they didn't want to see what was up ahead of them. Well, some of these Union soldiers, as they're coming up this slope here, this rise in the terrain, they're doing the same thing. They're leaning forward like they're walking into a rain and windstorm because they know what is coming for them. And men are falling all around. It is chaos. Men are being cut down by the scores here by the heavy rate of Confederate fire coming from the angle. But at the height of the attack, men do reach the Confederate works. And one of these men is Dan McCook, who stands on top of the Confederate works, puts his foot up on the headlog at the top of the Confederate trench, and has a sword, and he says, "Surrender, you damn traitors." Well, of course, they don't like that. They don't like that. So, in the midst of this battle, with men falling all around him, the Confederate soldier puts his gun right up to McCook's chest and fires. He falls back towards his own lines. And he's going to be taken back to a Union field hospital where he's examined. He's sent north to Steubenville, Ohio, his hometown. Actually, one of his brothers, one of his many brothers, Latimer McCook, who's a surgeon with one of the Union regiments here, accompanies him back to Ohio, and McCook dies on July 17th of 1864 from his wounds here at Kennesaw Mountain. When McCook falls, the next to take command is Colonel Oscar Harmon of the 125th Illinois. Just the day before the battle, Harmon had written a letter at home to his wife telling her, "If I fall, expect me to fall in my place, then no blame can attach to me." Well, it's not more than a few minutes after Harmon takes command that he is killed by a bullet to the head. Men are falling all around, and thus they have to begin falling back. But they will not fall back that far. The initial trench lines, they're going to fall back and dig in, right about here, right where we are now standing. And they're going to dig in rather than retreat all the way across this open space. And they're going to use anything they can. They're going to use their hands, fingers, plates, cups, bayonets, anything they can to dig in. And they're going to stay here for several days afterwards. Several days afterwards. On June 29th, while these men are still here, there's going to be a truce for the burial of the dead. After that, some of these Union soldiers are going to start tunneling their way underneath the Confederate positions. This is the remnants of that tunnel. The idea was to blow up that tunnel, detonate it on July 4th, and give the Confederates a good old-fashioned 4th of July. Well, they never had that chance. Because later on the day of the 27th, on the day of the main assault here, Sherman was convinced by his subordinates that this was a mistake. He was going to have to find another way around Johnston's position. He began shifting men towards the southern end of his line, trying to once again outflank Johnston and the Confederates. By the night of July 2nd, Johnston, becoming wise to this move, decides to pull back from Kennesaw Mountain, retreats first to Smyrna, Georgia, then onto the Chattahoochee River, and after the Chattahoochee, back to Atlanta. Johnston ultimately relieved of his command on July 17th, right outside of Atlanta, before falling back so far. Of course, then in July, the battles for Atlanta. In August, the siege around Atlanta. And on September 2nd, 1864, Atlanta will fall to Union forces, one of the most significant Union victories of the war, virtually ensuring the re-election of President Abraham Lincoln, and perhaps putting the final nail in the coffin for the Confederacy. The war would only last a few months longer. But here at Kennesaw Mountain, this was a pivotal battle on the road towards that struggle for Atlanta. It was a Confederate victory in an overall campaign that was a Union victory, but it was important for both sides. For Confederates, this was perhaps one of their last best chances to stop Sherman. They were able to stop him here briefly for a few days through hard fighting, but ultimately they were not able to seize the rewards after this victory. For Sherman, this battle had important lessons. He would never again launch a frontal assault of this type. This was his last frontal assault of his career. He would instead attack the Confederacy itself, attack their civilian resources, attack railroads, damage war resources rather than send men to their slaughter against fortified positions. Well over 3,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, fell here 150 years ago yesterday, far fewer than 1,000 Confederate casualties. Over 3,000 Union casualties alone. So what are we to make of all this? Well, as we wrap up, is that artillery firing is going to start very soon. We have to recall that yes, this battle was important in history. Yes, this battle had its importance for the Atlanta campaign. Yes, as we look back, it was an important event for us to remember 150 years later. But of course, this battle was also important for the individuals who fought here. One of those individuals was Copernicus Coffee of the 22nd Indiana. He has a marker on the trail that you walked on to get down here. Mortally wounded on June 27th. He died on June 29th. The letter was sent home to his mother on August 7th of 1864 saying, "Your son Copernicus was killed on June 27th, 1864, cast in the assault on the rebel works. He fell like a brave soldier, gallantly fighting in defense of his country and for the most sacred rights of man. This is the testimony of his comrades as to his courage, consistency, and patriotic devotion to his country and his comrades." Well, folks, for every one of these thousands of casualties here, there are families at home, there are mothers at home who are in many cases receiving letters like this one, telling them that they lost their children here at battles such as Kennesaw Mountain. And 150 years later, of course, we're remembering the strategic importance of events like this, the broad importance in the course of the war, but you also have to remember that this battle was fought by real people who made tremendous sacrifices here 150 years ago. I think I have left you with 5 minutes with which to get back. I make promises and I stick to them, folks. You have time to get back to that artillery firing. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thanks a lot.